I would like to ask with a question that many of us don't seem to have any kind of clear answer for. Whether India, what's going to happen? I mean, we all know what's happening, but is there any hope left for a secular, democratic, pluralist, country anymore, or are we really are we at the end of one part of of our history post independence? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are, I think that things are in great peril. What we have seen in the last 10 years is a really dramatic erosion and undermining of secular, plural, democratic aspirations. I mean, India was never perfect. India was always aspiring to a democratic and secular horizon. We were never quite there, but in the last 6 to 10 years, we have seen really rapid and very frightening erosion of those aspirations. I'm not going to be pessimistic and say that, game over. I think that there are a lot of people in the country who are still committed to everyday pluralism, to everyday coexistence, to everyday, creative engagement with each other. But I think that we are at a point where if we don't fight hard to retain something of a plural, multicultural, multi-religious heritage, we are in danger, absolutely, of losing that. And I think that we should not underestimate what we are up against. We are really up against, I think, the single biggest challenge to that idea post-independence.
Thinking about that, I mean, I was wondering, how do we trace the ideological lineage of Hindutva? I mean, many people believe that it's a result of the divide and rule policy of, and you have worked extensively on the empire. Is it a realistic assessment, or the roots of Hindutva actually lie far past beyond the colonial period? I mean, because many people tend to paint a rosy picture of Hindu-Muslim relations in pre-colonial times, which historically may not be that accurate, right? So how do you look at this?
I would not blame it simply on the British, and I simply would not say, well, this is a consequence of divide and rule. I mean, I think divide and rule had its place. It certainly worked in terms of consolidating hardcore Hindu and Muslim identities. But let's remember, divide and rule also pitted Hindu rulers against each other. It pitted Indian states against each other. So it was never just Hindu-Muslim. It was also very caste oriented, community oriented. I think that we can't discuss Hindutva as having a single origin. Certainly its roots lie very clearly in Brahminical supremacy. I mean, if you think about Hindutva as something, profoundly connected to the Hindu Mahasabha and then the RSS, these are not just Hindu organizations. These are very heavily Brahminical and upper caste organizations. So caste plays a very important role, stretching well beyond the arrival of the British into this country. But I think that the most important way in which we can think about Hindutva is that it is a very imitative idea. Really, it's not so much divide and rule as imitating colonial categories. Hindutva is premised on the idea that you need a single language, a single religion, and a single nation. And that idea, very ironically, comes out of Europe. It comes out of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries as Europe was becoming nation states. And it was presumed that in order to be a nation state, you had to all be Christian, you all had to speak the same language, and you all had to have a certain degree of racial homogeneity. So Hindutva is imitating European ideologies. And this is why eventually, when Nazism arrives in the picture, when Mussolini arrives and fascism arrive in the picture, the early propounders of Hindutva, including the early leaders of the RSS, were deeply attracted to both Mussolini and Hitler. And very explicitly, the RSS was imitating the Balila squads that Mussolini set up in Italy. So you can see that in very explicit ways, Hindutva is not a particularly organic Indian creation. It's a consequence of very lethal forms of caste supremacy and very imitative forms of Europeanness that has then been given a kind of Indian or Hindu framework. I mean, that in a way, that is the most ironic thing about Hindutva, that it claims to be profoundly Indian, but at the end of the day, it is profoundly European and colonial in origin, and of course, owes a great deal also to European fascism.
One problem that arises from, what you said right now is, if we look at the evolution of Hindutva, particularly during the last couple of decades, they seem to have somehow subsumed caste differences within the Hindutva fold. I mean, we see, a large number of Dalit organizations feeling very comfortable aligning with the BJP. For instance, look at Mayavadi sharing power with BJP in two, terms. Likewise, many Dalit intellectuals like Udit Raj and so on joined the BJP, came out of it later, of course. And right now, the only ally that the NDA, that BJP has in government is actually a version of the Republican Party, which is a Dalit organization, right? And Modi himself is not an upper caste Hindu. So, the traditional, argument about the Brahmanic or upper caste, orientation of Hindutva need to be re-looked at, in my opinion. How do you, respond?
Yes and no. I mean, any ideology that is in the ascendant has to find the cooperation of those it subjugates. So, there were a handful of Jews who were part of Nazism, who were part
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
fabric of the German Nazi state. So that's not in itself particularly surprising or unusual, because no ideology can succeed without, in some sense, co-opting the opposition. I would, however, also make a distinction between making pragmatic alliances, let us say, with Dalit or Dalit Bahujan political parties, and saying that therefore it is not Brahminical. You can be perfectly Brahminical, you can have alliances, you can even have token Muslims. I mean, the BJP has always kept Muslims and some Christians in its fold. And again, the parallel with colonialism is this, that colonialism always required the cooperation of many of those that it colonized. Colonialism could not have functioned, even in India, without the cooperation of Indian elites, Indian rulers, Indian officials, and people that it worked with. So that does not in and of itself invalidate the idea that the origins of Hindutva and that its dominant forces are still very Brahminical and Hindu. I just been reading, and I haven't finished, a very interesting memoir called Why I Can't Be a Hindu. And it's about a Dalit man who was in the RSS and, who basically hit a glass ceiling very, very soon and suddenly realized that what his family had been telling him was true, that at the end of the day, Dalits are not accepted by upper castes, and that there is a limit to which there can be kind of Dalit merging with Hindutva formations. I take your point that formations are constantly changing, and Hindutva in 1930 is different from Hindutva in 2020 because things change, history changes. But I don't think, I think the one thing that hasn't changed is that Hindutva is a dangerously exclusionary ethno-nationalist ideology based explicitly on religious majoritarianism. And that is a consistent thread. And unless, Hindutva were to really become something other than what it was when it started out, I think that thread still very much runs through it. And I don't think that the fact of alliances with Muslim or Dalit organizations changes the fact, for instance, that no head of the RSS is Dalit. In fact, they've all been historically Brahmin. And Brahmanism as an ideology runs through the RSS and therefore filters into the BJP as well. So I think we have to make a distinction between individuals and alliances and what the ideology itself consists of.
Okay. That brings me to my next question. You have done a lot of work on race and race relations and so on. And now we have been discussing caste. What, in your opinion, are the similarities and dissimilarities between race and caste, or racism and casteism? I mean, there are many people who argue that actually casteism is much more pernicious than racism, because of the kind of religious, structure within which it functions. What are your thoughts on these two phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are that race and caste can be put in very interesting dialogue, and people have started to do it. So, Isabel Wilkerson, who's an African-American journalist, has written a book called Caste, where she, talks about the relationship between the two. There are young Dalit intellectuals like Suraj Yengde, who've been also talking about, caste and race. I think it's important to put them in dialogue and look at some of the overlaps, but understand that they emerged in very different circumstances. So racism emerges as a consequence of enslavement and colonialism, and it becomes the justificatory ideology in the first instance for enslavement. Indians dealt with racism through the British Raj, but actually racism took its most pernicious forms in the slave colonies of the Caribbean and then North America. And the people who have suffered most deeply and still suffer most deeply from racism are people of African descent living in the United States or living with the legacies of enslavement in the Caribbean. Caste, as you suggested, is in a way much more pernicious because it is, it's been here for centuries longer than racism as we understand it. It has scriptural sanction. It has multiple forms that it has taken over, the millennia. It is also a much more complicated and variegated system than racism. So I don't want to compare and contrast in the sense that I don't want to say one is worse than the other one. If you're African American and you're living in a ghetto in the south of the United States, your experience is probably just as bad as being a Dalit in UP today. But I think the important thing to recognize is that there are overlaps in terms of systemic discrimination, exploitation, and disenfranchisement of people based on their birth and their skin color and their origins, but also significant differences in how they operate depending on where you are. Where I think they do overlap in important ways is in terms of the importance of making reparations. So we have Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter has found echoes in some people talking about Dalit lives mattering. But I think we don't have the equivalent movement in India yet on that scale. We don't have a Dalit Lives Matter movement at the level of Black Lives Matter. But I think there are groups both in the United States, in Britain as well, and in India in different ways, raising the question of the importance of reparations. When you have kept people down for decades or centuries and made it actually pretty much impossible for them to have any form of real social mobility, you might have a few token successes, then I think in both cases, we are talking about very important systemic changes of making reparations to entire communities that are disenfranchised and whose condition makes a complete mockery of so-called equality of opportunity. A young African-American male and a young Dalit male do not have the same chances as say, a young white male or a young upper caste Savarna Brahmin male. And I think that A, acknowledgement of disenfranchisement, and B, a serious discussion of what forms reparations might take. I think that is something in common in both cases. And the other thing that I think is in common, we have now started hearing much more from Black intellectuals and Black campaigners and Black journalists and writers in America. Not enough, but we have started to hear from them. I think we need to be hearing much, much more from Dalit Bahujan campaigners, writers, intellectuals, activists, because the public sphere in India is still very dominated by upper castes. And I would put myself in that category as well. And I think we need to be hearing much more from outside those very familiar circles. We need to be hearing more Dalit voices, just as we are, starting to hear more from Black voices.
You made some very fascinating points, which reminded me of Barack Obama's Promised Land. I just finished reading the book. And throughout the book, it's about 700 plus pages, he is not apologetic about his Black identity. He talks openly about the kind of discrimination that is being meted out to Blacks in America, even now. And he even, says that many of the criticisms that he faced during his presidency were because his name was Barack Hussein Obama. Now, I was wondering, we can never expect a book of the same openness and frankness from, say, somebody like K.R. Narayan, who was the president of India. I mean, people who come up from a Dalit background, they generally tend to downplay their Dalit origins and attribute their success to some kind of a larger virtue which is beyond their you know what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah, I do. I haven't read Promised Land, and I suppose I would say, though, that Barack Obama's record is not one of championing African American communities in the United States. I'm sure he refers to his background in the Promised Land. He has referred to it in other contexts. But in many ways, he did let the wider African American communities down. He did not speak up on race significantly or often enough when it mattered. He did not actually take the kind of bold economic and reparative decisions that would have meant significant emancipation for African Americans, who are, behind as a community on every welfare indicator in the United States. So I suppose I would take what you're describing with a pinch of salt, because he did spend a great deal of time playing down race. He did spend a great deal of time, claiming that America was post-racial, and pretending that his presidency meant that America had moved forward on race. As we have seen just 6 months ago, America has not moved forward on race. He was immediately followed by, in a sense, a white supremacist president. So I think that I'm not sure that I would say that we couldn't have in India a Barack Obama. In a way, of course, Dr. Ambedkar spoke very clearly about what it meant to be a Dalit in India on the brink of independence. So, the annihilation of caste is much more frank and unflinching and trenchant than I would imagine anything Barack Obama has written. But I think your point is this: is can we imagine now a Dalit, a prime minister who would be able to be true to the community and to be able to speak frankly and boldly on behalf of the realities of caste and the realities of Dalit life. And I think that whether it's in the United States or whether it's in India, that is still an open question. And I very much hope, and I actually very much also, I think in some sense, believe that there is potential for a charismatic Dalit leader to emerge and do precisely what I think you're pointing to come up and to be charismatic and articulate and eloquent and speak about the realities of caste in India today.
Uh, I have always felt that the left in general, and we are talking about the non-Marxist left as well as the Marxist left. On the question of caste, I find all left intellectuals in India pretty confused. When I was in JNU, I tried to engage many of our top intellectuals in conversations about these. Many of them tend to confuse caste with class at some level. At another level, I mean, most of them, since they come from upper caste backgrounds, perhaps, a theoretical understanding was not enough to actually grasp, the nitty-gritty of caste and the multiple layers, within which it operates. So what are your thoughts, particularly on the Marxist intelligentsia in India, right from the beginning till now? If we look at everyone from M.N. Roy through E.M.S. Namboodiripad to the current, bunch of Marxist intellectuals in India, can we say that none of them got caste right?
I think it is fair to say, and I would include myself in this, although I have no party affiliation, that those of us who come from upper caste backgrounds have had historically very little understanding of caste. I mean, if I look back on my own time in JNU, I was there a couple of years before you, I was completely naive and outright stupid about caste. I didn't understand a damn thing. And I spent quite a lot of time, even though I was not part of the party left, believing in the supremacy of class over caste. And in a curious way, it is experiencing how race works that has made me go back and think about how caste has worked, right? And I am struck by my own naivete, my own illiteracy, my own absolute stupidity on the question of caste. And the reason for that is that if you are upper caste, if you are, Brahmin in particular, you have the privilege of not needing to know about caste. And you have the privilege of running around mouthing stupidities like class matters more, as though class and caste and all these things weren't tied up in very complicated ways. So I would say that if the rest of the Indian left, upper caste left, shared even half of my own ignorance, then yeah, I mean, caste is a blind spot, and I don't think that upper caste intellectuals have ever really grasped the seriousness and the depth and the historical heft and complexity of caste. I don't want to generalize too much because obviously there are people who work on caste, who are trying to think about caste issues, and I don't think it's impossible for people on the left to engage with caste, but historically it has been a blind spot. Historically, there has been much too much regurgitation of class, not caste. And I think that this is the reason that a few minutes ago I said we need to be hearing, reading, and learning from Dalit activists and intellectuals much, much more, because you can't rectify such an ignorance and blind spot on your own. You have to put yourself in the position of being a student and really learning from those who experience it, those who understand it, those who know about it, to understand what the realities of caste are. And I mean, I'm just starting to kind of rectify my own gaps by reading. I think we have a very long way to go. I guess that's what the bottom line is.
I want to move now into issues of higher education in India. We have seen what's happening in JNU. I mean, the past 6 years, they have almost completely destroyed in an institution which made many of us. In my case, born and brought up in a small village in Kerala. It is JNU that, I'm thankful to JNU for everything that I did or achieved in my life. When I went to JNU in 1993, I was a village boy, with absolutely no exposure. I mean, in one of the most interesting experiences in the beginning for me was everyone kept talking about Michel Foucault. And and I was wondering who this guy is. So I didn't understand. And finally, when a couple of friends and I were discussing, they looked askance at me. You don't know who is Michel Foucault? So I said, can you please write his name? Oh, then I said, okay, Michael Foucault. I had read Foucault much before, but I didn't know how to pronounce his name. So the kind of rural-urban divide that you feel, and one overcomes it, of course, over time. And of course, the campus exposed one to multiple strands of thought, various disciplines of social sciences, literature, and so on and so forth. Now, last 6 years, we see everything that we saw at that time being undone, little by little, to such an extent that now I understand that JNU is filled with mediocrities. I mean, every new vacancy is, filled with people who have ideological allegiance to RSS. And I'm sure you have been following, as I told you, I wrote a, memoir on my life in JNU, and I also happened to write a few pieces in English for Outlook, during this last few years. So what are your thoughts on what's happening in JNU currently, and what are its implications on the future of JNU as an academic institution of some high standing?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about what was happening in JNU for The Guardian for
I
a
read
few
that.
years.
I read that. Yeah.
Look, when we were there in JNU, it was not perfect by a long shot. There were, we talked about caste just now, for instance. We talked about the rural-urban divide. There were lots of problems in JNU. It could often be a very smug place. It could often be it thought of itself as radical when it wasn't always radical. But that said, you and I both shared an experience of a real kind of political and intellectual awakening when we got there. I didn't know who Foucault was either. I don't think I knew who Foucault was. I graduated from JNU. I had never heard of post-structuralism before I got there. And, JNU could be very smug and conceited and all of those things. But it was a pretty special place in the sense that I did meet people I would never have otherwise met, in my kind of women's college in Delhi University, which was very, very, homogeneous in terms of the kind of caste and gender and community makeup. I think the most important things that happened in JNU were not necessarily in the classroom. It was the meetings that we had at night. It was all the political arguments. It was all this, real sense of impassioned commitment to changing society. We had, hugely different views about how to do it, but it was, I think, a place where there was a clear understanding that intellectual life and social change had to be brought together, that the academy did not exist in isolation. What we have seen in the last 6 years in particular is a ferocious, concerted, and very deliberate attack on JNU. And I think that in a way, that's a compliment, because I think that in order for the present dispensation to function, it needs to eradicate even campus challenges, right? Because JNU is one of the few places where you couldn't really get away with just spouting, dominant ideologies or Hindutva or even, Congress received ideas and get away without challenge. People, anybody, you could be any political caliber and you would be challenged. You would be asked to account for yourself. What we see in the attack on JNU is that we now have a regime that cannot bear the slightest opposition, that cannot bear the slightest challenge, and that you have to actually crack down as hard as you did on a bunch of students and lecturers. And of course, I have several friends at JNU, who were essentially suspended, and who are, probably not going to teach there again. So I think that this is very telling. It's very telling in one sense of the nature of the present dispensation, its inability to deal with intellectual ideas, its inability to deal with challenge, its inability to deal with debate. It certainly cannot deal with criticism. And it's very telling, I think, in a good way for those of us who do intellectual work, which is to say intellectual work matters. Because a regime of this nature, if it can be threatened by intellectual work, right? If it can be threatened by a campus that is wedded to discussions into the night, then that means these discussions matter. And therefore, for me, it just makes me want to renew my commitment to transformative intellectual work. I don't want to be smug about it, but I can see, okay, what we do matters. But I have to also say, I mean, we talk about JNU, but I want to say two things. We now see across the country, particularly Dalit and Muslim intellectuals being rounded up, arrested, jailed, harassed. And they're not JNU people necessarily. They are from across the country. And that is something we should be taking very, very seriously because, as they say, they may at first come for 6 or 7 people, and then eventually they will come for the rest. And I think that is something to worry about, that we are now in a society where journalists, writers, filmmakers, intellectuals are, in peril. And it's getting more and more difficult. The other thing I would say about the JNU episode is this, that, at least JNU got some national and international attention. But I remember that when we were all lamenting about JNU, friends from Kashmir were saying, this has been happening to our universities for decades now. Curfew, military presence, shutting down of this, that, and the other. So it also reminds you that for many years, places like JNU were very privileged, where other places, like in Kashmir, were seeing the jackboot much earlier than places like JNU did. I hope what comes out of what we're seeing now is, again, I think, a renewal of commitment to opposing the present dispensation. I hope we can make alliances across all these groups.
That brings to mind the question of future of higher education in India. I mean, the cultural and educational policies of the present dispensation are kind of destroying a vibrant intellectual culture we have had for a very long time. I mean, I'm not being smug, but I think it would be factually correct to say that we have had the best intellectual achievements compared to many other developing countries. I mean, the level of scholarship that has been produced in India, in various disciplines, on par with the best in the world in many ways, not just in JNU, but also across India in various universities. Now, because of the kind of oppressive environment that is being created in the realm of higher education, do you think we are on the verge of losing that advantage that we have? I mean, for instance, you are teaching at Cambridge and you're teaching English, which I think also says a lot about the kind of higher education that we have had in the country. Now that entire thing is being reduced, little by little. What are your thoughts on the future of intellectual work in India?
Oh, no, it's in danger. I mean, JNU has had, for instance, world ranking status. It will now lose it. I mean, I can't think of, seeing the kinds of people who have essentially been pushed out of JNU or will be pushed out of JNU, for instance, or Delhi University for that matter, or Hyderabad. If you push the intellectuals and academics and scholars who are currently being harassed and pushed out, you are going to end up, and that's already happening, with political appointments, with mediocrities, with people who have absolutely no ranking or respect, even nationally, never mind internationally, right? So you are just going to have, bureaucrats sitting as chairs of departments or vice chancellors. And JNU, I would say, is probably already lost, slipped down the rankings quite considerably.
Yes, it
And
did.
nobody
Yeah.
who wants to do serious intellectual work will stay in the country because it's becoming increasingly impossible to stay and do serious, good intellectual work because it's devalued by the present dispensation, and it is, you know, it is seen as threatening. And particularly, for instance, we know that the Indian Council for Historical Research, people have been pushed out and been replaced by political appointments. And I would say that these are bodies that are in danger of becoming international laughingstock, and no one will take Indian universities seriously if this carries on.
Now I want to move on to, another area which you have, your first two books were broadly on literature. So I want to ask you, what is Indian literature? I mean, is there something called Indian literature? Literature written in too many different languages, representing too many different, cultural milieus. And into this complex spectrum, we have Indian writing in English. Is it? And then many people tend to think that it is less Indian than literature written in the bhashas. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember reading, a book by Malayalam poet and critic Sachidanandan on the whole concept of Indian literature. What is it? I mean, what are your thoughts on the whole idea of Indian literature? How is Malayalam literature Indian literature? I mean, what is it that makes Malayalam literature part of Indian literature, for instance?
There is no, self-evident connection. Indian literature is what we have deemed it to be in terms of what is produced within the boundaries of the nation state, right? So Indian literature has no meaning other than that, okay, these are the constituent, if contested, boundaries of the nation state. Here are the literatures that are produced within its borders. This is a much discussed topic, so I'm not sure I can bring anything especially new to it. I don't think that there is anything known as Indian literature in an absolute sense. That said, there is a context for the production of different literatures in Kannada, in Malayalam, in Hindi, in Urdu, and to the extent that they are produced under the banner of the Indian, broader Indian nation state, we can call them Indian literature. But actually, I don't think any literature, and I'm increasingly of this opinion, should be tied up to nation states. So in fact, in my own department at Cambridge, we are now questioning what is English literature and the ways in which, for instance, calling something English literature has historically left out Welsh, Cornish, Scottish, Irish literature, right? So we could call it the literatures of the United Kingdom, but again, that's a very kind of bureaucratic title to give it. I'm increasingly of the opinion that we should study literature and we should remove qualifiers relating to nation states from literature. And in reality, that is what a lot of people are doing. So I have, several PhD students who are working in an English department, but they are working on anything, from Kashmiri literature to Palestinian literature to the literature of South Africa. Some of them are working not just in materials in English, some of them are bringing in Arabic writing, Hebrew writing, and of course Hindi and Urdu. In any case, a lot of people work on those in English departments. So I think increasingly tying literature departments to nation state forms, I think, is obsolete. And I think we really need to be thinking more in terms of literature and then having debates and discussions within that broader framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And I am aware of your rebellion within Cambridge for revision of literature's curriculum, which at that time, when I read about it,
students,
when I read about it, I think it was a few years ago. I wondered what V.S. Naipaul would have thought about it.
Yeah, he would hate it.
He would hate it, of course. Yeah.
He would absolutely hate it.
Yeah. So, now another related issue that I'm totally ignorant about it. I just want to know from you. I mean, in Kerala, for instance, we have had a very, very strong literary critical, foundation. I mean, large number of books which actually competed with works of fiction and poetry in terms of originality, in terms of readability, etc. Till the late 1990s, we have had, very many luminaries in the language, who only wrote literary criticism, but in a way that appealed to wider audiences. But my sense is that even globally, and of course in English, I remember reading Harold Bloom with a lot of interest at one point in time. I mean, you may disagree on many things, but there was a way in which literary criticism was made an interesting, subject, unlike the highbrow, jargonized kind of literary criticism that is written by academics for academics. So where does literary criticism stand today? I mean, has it died a natural death, or is it that we only have book reviews now? I mean, no more serious literary criticism that is accessible to the reading publics in different languages.
I would say that my role model in this instance is not so much Harold Bloom, although I take your point, as Edward Said, right? So Edward Said's Orientalism, Culture, and Imperialism were and still are read by lay people, by people who are not necessarily research scholars, and they're sold in ordinary bookshops. And I think Said said a couple of things that are relevant to your question here. He said, and he warned against increasing specialization in universities to the point where the humanities are removing themselves constantly from public access by developing a highly specialized jargon. He warned against it, and I think that we have seen his warnings coming, more or less largely true, that literary criticism has become a highly specialized, expertise, jargon-driven discipline. Not everyone, but by and large. I think what you're pointing to is a symptom of a larger problem. It's not that there aren't people who can write for the public sphere, and there are certainly lots of literary critics who are not academics who are writing in journals and magazines. I think the issue is that increasingly universities are becoming highly corporatized spaces, where people are expected to become highly specialized and justify their existence by becoming highly specialized. Said wanted intellectuals to be public intellectuals. He thought that there should be a real effort, particularly in the use of language, of breaking down the barrier between between academic spaces and a public readership. And I think what you're pointing to is the potential disappearance of the public intellectual because of high specialization, because of the demands of universities, which are increasingly functioning like factories and corporations. And that is a worry. It is a worry if we start to lose literary critics who can't actually address a wider public sphere. We still have historians who are able to reach beyond the academy. But I think literature has not really returned to that moment where it was possible to address a wider public. And I think that what your question suggests is that literary critics should be thinking very seriously about their role as public intellectuals.
I'm glad you have mentioned Edward Said. I have been a great admirer of Edward Said. I mean, being an Arabist, of course, there is another connection to Said's work as well. I mean, earlier I had no plan to ask you this question, but I have a hunch that after Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, did anyone produce any major work of scholarship in cultural criticism that whose relevance lasted more than 10 years? Because if we look at all the major works that came out in social sciences after the 1980s, my hunch is that none of them remained relevant for more than 10 years. I mean, if you look at social sciences, for instance, Samuel Huntington and Fukuyama were raging icons in the 1990s when I was in JNU, but within a few years, most of the stuff that they predicted became stale and totally wrong. So, are we looking at a kind of end of that kind of oceanic encyclopedic scholarship? I mean, has it ended at a particular point in time, and now we have various levels of ephemeralities coming up as scholarship? I hope my question is clear.
I'm not so pessimistic. I think for instance, a lot of people have written good books, and they're not. I think Harold Bloom, for instance, in a way, what he did came at the expense, in some ways, of really engaging with the wider questions being thrown up by academia. In a way, he was a very deliberate. He positioned himself as a throwback. He positioned himself as a maverick. He positioned himself as somebody who wasn't doing all these things that his colleagues were doing, and he was reaching out to. In a way, it's easier to do that if your thinking is mainstream, if your thinking is orthodox, if your thinking bolsters certain structures of power, as indeed Bloom did. We can also see, for instance, in Britain and in the US, right-wing historians have much more of a readership in some ways than people who aren't actively pacifying the forces of conservatism or reaction. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic and say, well, that kind of encyclopedic thought is gone. I think what we're seeing is a change in the intellectual milieu. We're seeing a change in the way in which academics, the conditions under which academics work. Increasingly people don't have tenure. People are working under precarious conditions. People are working under political pressure. So the ability to sit back and to actually just write an encyclopedic book without worrying about, 100 academic duties, 100 administrative duties, publish or perish, that moment is gone. Structurally, that moment is not there. And young academics are not in a position to sit back, as, Edward Said or Harold Bloom, for that matter, were able to do, and just produce magisterial work. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I don't think that we have lost the ability to do that. I think what we have to think about now is the conditions in which people are producing books, the conditions in which people are given publication contracts. I mean, the publishing industry, I know this from my own discussions with editors and agents, they're not interested necessarily in the great, patient, magisterial, encyclopedic work. They want hot topics. And they want books to be produced in 6 months, 1 year, so that it can plug into an immediate controversy. And when you have a publishing industry that does that, then you're not going to get the great magisterial, patient works of thinking. What I would call slow scholarship. The conditions for that are not really very promising at the moment.
You once spoke about different notions of freedom, particularly in the context of colonialism. You said, I mean, the notion of freedom differs from place to place, and I think, if I remember correctly, you compared the notions of freedom existing in 19th century Britain with the notions of freedom that a Jamaican farmer may be experiencing in today's context. I mean, if I take that argument in the context of today, your position can be criticized for being relativistic, in some ways. For instance, Saudi Arabia could say that we are not allowing as much freedom as or the kind of freedoms that exist within Saudi Arabia are different, and you cannot say that you have to implement the kind of freedoms that exist in the West, because our notions of freedom are totally different. And I'm sure a Sangh Parivar ideologue would say the same about India. So could you elaborate a little bit on your idea of different kinds of freedoms or different notions of freedoms?
Yeah, I mean, I will make one immediate distinction. There is an immediate distinction between saying that notions of freedom are contextually developed and saying that, therefore, it's a free-for-all. One of the things I take great pains to explain in the introduction to the book is that relativism is not at all what I'm talking about. In fact, what I'm talking about is impulses against tyranny that all cultures share. And my primary point was that the definition of freedom comes from those who are struggling, not those who are in power. So I would take my cues about the contextual importance of definitions of freedom in Saudi from Saudi dissidents and not from the Saudi government. It is those who are struggling against tyranny who get to define power, freedom. So just as I said, the British Empire always claimed that it was giving freedom to the rest of the world. And the point is, you cannot give freedom. Freedom always has to be struggled for. And it is those who are struggling, whether it's in Jamaica or in another example I use, whether it's in Egypt in 1882, where you have a rebellion of the peasants and the army against Turkish rule, against the Turkish Caliph in Cairo. So the most important point that I wanted people to really go away with was that, of course, things are contextually defined. There isn't a general definition of freedom, but definitions of freedom are to be found from those who are struggling against power and oppression and not from above, if that makes sense.
Sure. It will, I'll be being unfair if I don't mention your Research and Empire in this conversation, a book that I loved reading. I mean, it was sent, and so I actually wanted to ask you about the contrast between your take and Shashi Tharoor's. I mean, I don't want you to get into the details, but I also want to ask you a question about, I mean, when we talk about intellectuals from colonized countries influencing British dissident thinking. I mean, who are the prominent Indian intellectuals in the 19th century who influenced British thinking against the empire?
In the 19th century, you don't have so many. What I talk about in the Indian context is British travelers who come to India and who meet different.
I know, yeah.
People. I also talk about the importance of 1857 in Britain in terms of, there aren't again specific intellectuals, but understanding what was happening in India troubled a minority of British dissidents who decided that they identified not with the ruling classes of Britain, but that they identified with the Indians who were rebelling against the British in 1857. The most interesting figure I talk about in the book is, of course, Shapurji Saklatwala,
yeah.
who is a relative of the Tatars, but a poor relative, and who goes to England and becomes the third Asian MP in Britain. And he's a really fascinating figure because he's someone who is in touch with Indian nationalists, who is in touch with even people like, Lokmanya Tilak. He himself is a communist. And he becomes a kind of interpreter between Britain and Indian nationalism and Indian anti-colonialism and British dissidents. So I think that in the book, the most important Indian figure to emerge would be somebody like Shapurji Saklatwala. But at the same time, obviously people like Tilak, people like Gandhi are also, in a sense, being heard in the British public sphere and are becoming embraced by various dissidents. M.N. Roy to a lesser extent.
See, talking about Gandhi, I mean, I may be wrong, but Gandhi's ideas seem to have influenced and inspired a lot of intellectuals in America, in Africa, so on and so forth. But in Great Britain at that time, I can't think of a single top intellectual who was influenced by Gandhi's ideas. Many of them were influenced by Gandhi's persona, his personality, but not his ideas. I mean, from Bernard Shaw to so many others who interacted with him or studied or looked at him from close quarters. Am I right in saying that Gandhi's ideas never influenced anybody in Great Britain during the colonial period?
That's true. I mean, certainly, I obviously don't talk about Gandhi in the book.
I know, yeah.
a volume of work on Gandhi.
Yeah.
But I certainly think that things like non-violence and his several trips to Britain, where he also addressed, among others, mill workers in Lancashire. These were certainly picked up in the British press and discussed. They were also raised in Parliament and discussed. I'm not enough of a Gandhi expert to know if there were particular intellectuals who were, Gandhian. I don't think they were, but I think that
my question is based on my reading of Ramachandra Guha's 2 volumes on Gandhi. I see a large number of intellectuals from different countries around the world being quoted in the book, but I can't, remember even one single British intellectual being, quoted, talking about Gandhi's ideas.
Unless of course you talk about people like C.F. Andrews, who were
No, I'm not. I don't even consider them as part of the British establishment.
Yes.
I mean, it's
So
So,
that's it. I mean, it's not. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but that is interesting.
Yeah. Now, finally, I think our time is up. Share your thoughts, impressions, memories. Since we are doing it for a Malayalam publication, I mean, I would like you to tell us something about your experience with Kerala, Malayalis, Malayalam literature, culture, or whatever you're comfortable talking about.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But can I just ask you, did you want me to answer the question about Tharoor?
I definitely do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll say this. I think the big difference between.
By the way, he's a good friend of mine too.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think the difference in approach that we have is this. He talks quite explicitly in the introduction to his book about how, when he started to write the book, he thought it was very strange that he had to write it, because for him it was nationalism 101. That, this is things that he had learned in school and he was kind of then putting into the book. My approach is not nationalism. So where, Dr. Tharoor very explicitly and openly uses a nationalist framework, my interest is not in nationalism, because I think the trouble with nationalism is that it enacts exclusions and mythologies of its own. My approach was more to think about anti-colonialism and to think about the content of anti-colonialism, and to also think about the alliances between dissidents in the colonies and dissidents in Britain, and the kind of common ground that they could create. So I guess in one sense, my approach is transnational and anti-colonial, and his approach is national and nationalist.
I completely agree with you. And in his most recent book, I mean, he takes the whole idea of nationalism to some kind of absurd lengths, trying to
belonging book. Yeah, I haven't.
And trying to make some unconvincing distinction between patriotism and nationalism and so on. Perhaps compulsions of being a politician. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, So now, coming to Kerala. Nothing in specific. I mean, anything that you would like to.
Listen, I went to Kerala for the first time. I'm Tamil by origin, and so I've been to Tamil Nadu quite a few times as a younger person, as a child. I made my first proper visit to Kerala 2019, right? So or 2018, and we went to Cochin, and I was very keen to go there, and I was very keen to see the synagogue in particular. And I absolutely loved Cochin. I absolutely loved, and I'm not kind of making this up, I loved being in Kerala. And I think one of the things that I appreciated about Kerala, and one of the reasons I wanted to go there, is that because it's a consequence of a coastal trading culture, it is, like it or not, it is an example of multi-religious, multicultural, multi-community living. And you can see that, the minute you're in Kerala, you are in a very vibrantly plural society, at least in Cochin. And for me, that gave me a great deal of hope, because I thought, actually in everyday life, people know how to live together. They may fight, they may disagree, there may be conflicts, there may be huge disagreements, but people know conviviality. They know how to live together and to, in a sense, somehow have an everyday pluralism. It was very joyous to see the synagogue and to kind of recall the histories just of Jews in Kerala and their history. Of course, sadly, there are fewer and fewer of them left. But I think for me, Kerala is an example, A, of that kind of living, and B, the fact is that the biggest bulwarks against a particular kind of homogenizing ethno-nationalism are in the south now, and they are in, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and perhaps to some extent Andhra Pradesh. And I would very much hope that between Kerala and Tamil Nadu, who are very, very different, of course, in their politics, some kind of meaningful resistance to the incursions of Hindutva can be provided.
I'm increasingly pessimistic about Kerala being, much of a source of resistance, because we see, unfortunately, things are turning. Of course, I still look at Tamil Nadu as the only hope, where some kind of.
I don't rule out Kerala for two reasons. I mean, as you said, I mean, there have been, communalism is everywhere, and intolerance is everywhere. So I didn't mean to give a completely rosy picture of it, but the fact is that Kerala has, this is a cliche, but it has this amazing literacy situation. It is a situation. It is a culture where people still read and talk ideas, and I think that at the end of the day, maybe this is the academic in me. I do think that a culture where people are literate and where people read, there is still hope for disseminating.
To a great extent, of course. I mean, I remember, when you use the word conviviality, I was thinking of an oral history of Cochin that Ashish Nandi had done a few years. I wonder if you have seen that.
No, I haven't. I mean, I know about it.
It's a long essay in his book Time Warps, and if I remember correctly, he uses the word convivencia from Islamic Spain, to compare the kind of pluralism that he had seen in Kochi. I mean, it's of course, I mean, we have, but until very recently, many of us used to feel that we were different, but now many people like me, we tend to think that, of course, whatever, we have right now can be attributed not to our intellectual, traditions, but perhaps to the kind of particular demographics we have, The minorities constitute about 45% of the.
Those demographics are about everyday coexistence. And the more heterogeneous a society and the more it values that, the more likely it is to be able to resist ethno-nationalism. I hope. I mean,
I too. I mean, we have to hold on to some hope. I mean, otherwise, what's the whole point of this discourse? I mean, it's
exactly.
So, thank you so very much, Professor Priyamvada. Wonderful talking to you.